8 months ago. And this is something that I've been picking up bits and pieces of through a series of college level classes, and you get bits and pieces of this, and I've been trying to put it all together. And so I'm going to do one half of it tonight, and the next half tomorrow night, Lord willing. And what I hope to do is show you some, if anything else, clues. And this is one of the last things that I've really taken time to tackle, is the Egyptian period of the Bible, the Exodus time and Joseph's time in Egypt. And as I began to look at this, I said, well, I guess the first thing I need to do is start off with what academia says the timeline is, and I wanted to start from there. And so what I did, and I have to give credit to Lynn Stratton, a friend of ours from San Francisco, that he has studied Egyptian so much, I think he's starting to think Egyptian. And so he began asking questions, are you using the high chronology or the low chronology? And so I just went out and looked to see if you were going out to look at the dates, and if you went out on the internet, what are the most common dates? Now, first of all, I will begin by telling you, in 2006, there was a major overhaul of Egyptian dates that I didn't even know about until I started doing this. There was an archaeologist that was from the Chicago Oriental Institute. That is, by the way, the museum that is used in the Indiana Jones movies where Indiana Jones worked. But Henry Breasted came up with the chronology for the Egyptians, and for years, they had used a single, non-overlapping chronology of the dynasties. I don't know why they did that. So as you look here, you've got 11th dynasty, a 12th dynasty, 13, 14, 15, and then you've got a 6th. This jumps down to 18. And then you've got 19, and then 20, 21. And to help me do this, I color-coded the dynasties as to where their capitals were. And before we go further, I think one thing I need to tell you, when you say the term Lower Egypt and Upper Egypt, it can be confusing if you're looking at a map, because we're used to looking north and south. But lower and upper is in terms of elevation. So Lower Egypt is going to be north, and Upper Egypt will be south, as we look at the map, and that can sometimes be important. So then I began to lay out the biblical dates that we have, that we can come up with. And I try to list those in blue, and you're not going to be able to see those, but right now they won't hopefully make that much difference. So here we've got Lower Egypt, and then Upper Egypt down here. And with this projector, you can't really tell. So like these dynasties are in red, and so that's their capitals, and so on and so forth. And so what we'll do here is try to make some heads or tails of this. There is a man named Timothy Mahoney. He lives in Minnesota, and he made a thing called Patterns of Evidence, the Exodus. Now, that's a fairly good documentary, and he goes into a lot of detail, and I found out some things that I didn't know, but they're included now in this chart. But I wouldn't recommend his later series of things, because, especially like on the 7 churches of Asia. So I don't know how accurately that those have been done. I've not watched it. So around 970 BC, we have a pretty hard date, and a lot of people are using 966 BC, so between 966 to 970 BC. Solomon begins his temple in 1 Kings chapter 6 and verse 1. It tells us that it was 480 years after this event that they came out of the land of Egypt, and that's going to land you right around the 1450 date here of the Exodus. So that kind of gives us some lay of the land. This date is, I think, fairly certain at this point, and then you add the 480 years on. Then I'll try to explain this. So in Exodus 12, 40, and 41, it says, in the years that the Israelites were in the land of Egypt was 430 years. Now, in Galatians chapter 3 and verse 17 and the verses around there, Paul there mentioning the 430 years. The way Paul says it, it seems that it's 430 years from the time Abraham received the promise until the Exodus. And as we look at this, I want to show you some examples here. And if we go with these dates as they are right now, I'm going to show you some parallels. So the source for the Egyptian dates that are used today, one of the main sources, is from an individual who lived in 300 BC. So he didn't live, he lived 300 years before Christ. And so that's 670 years after the building of Solomon's temple. He is a Greek Egyptian. The Ptolemies controlled Egypt at that time. Ptolemy had been a general in Alexander's army, and then you have the Ptolemy the first, Ptolemy the second, Ptolemy the third. One of the Ptolemies wanted Necho, is his name, to come up and, close to 300 BC, and come up and write out the dynasties of the kings. Josephus uses some of Necho's dates. However, he's critical of some of his dates. And, this may seem tedious, but there's going to be some interesting information here. So what he ended up writing are 3 volumes. And so you have Dynasties 1 through 11, and that's the really ancient Egypt, and that goes back to the Great Pyramid time period. Then you have the Middle Kingdom, and there is this thing called the Hyksos invasion we're going to spend some time on. And then there is the Dynasty 20 through 31, and this is a photo of what Necho's writings look like. There is also an older kings list, and it was made by Ramses II. And it's called the Abydos Kings List. And it lists a group of pharaohs, and it begins here. And these are Pharaoh Cartouches. And so they know which Pharaoh it is. And so the 19th dynasty, which Ramses II is a part of, is there. And then you go to the 18th dynasty, and it shows that it is these pharaohs. And then you jump from the 18th dynasty to the 12th dynasty. So he omits 13th through the 17th dynasties. And there's a reason for that. He wants to omit the reigns of Tutankhamun, Akhenaten, and that period of the Amarna period. He wants to erase, but at the same time, there's a lot of other dynasties that are out of this. I think they may have added back in too many pharaohs and dynasties that they have uncovered. Then you go back to the 11th dynasty. And this is really the period that we're going to be looking at right in here. And when you go online and you look, there's a lot more pharaohs in this time period than what he is willing to put upon his timeline. So let's go back, and if we're using the 430-year date from the Exodus, and if we say that that date, the Exodus is here, and we go back and add 430 years, and we start doing the math, it's going to put Jacob coming to Israel in 1880. Now, this is if we overlook and say, hey, it wasn't the 430 years from the time that Abraham received the promise, but we're saying that it's 430 years that they were there. So we're going to take a look at it this way first. So if you do it this way, then we can come up with some hard dates based on knowing that 430-year period. Jacob lives 147 years, and he lives 17 years in the land of Egypt before he dies. Therefore, we can do some math. We know that Jacob is born, I have to use my memory now. I had a concussion, a pretty bad concussion, 2 years ago. And sometimes I have trouble bringing things up that used to just jump right up. And so bear with me here. So Jacob is in his 90s when Joseph was born. And then Isaac is easy to extrapolate backwards from Jacob there. And then we've got Abraham to the left of that. And we know that Abraham is 100 years old when Isaac was born. So Joseph coming to Egypt here, we know that he is 30 years old when he's promoted. He's 17 years when he goes into Egypt. And so then you can go backwards from that. And so we see that in Genesis 37:2, he's 17. He is the ruler in 1889 there at 30 years of age. And then Jacob moves 9 years after that, being 137 years old. Jacob dies at 147, and then Joseph dies at being 110, so that's going to be around 1809. Now, things that are happening in Egypt at this time is interesting. Now, you know that your 40-year period is 40 years after the Exodus, so that's easy to put in. So therefore, you have 40 years that Moses is in Midian, and then he's born, so he's going to be born right about in this time around 1535, right here. And these dates are pretty solid, I think. But then we have this passage in Exodus that kind of just knocks our dominoes down. Because when you read in Exodus that Levi lived to be 137 years, and Kohath lives to be 133 years, and we see that Kohath is alive when Levi and the other patriarchs come to Egypt to live in Goshen. And then you have Amram, and that's Moses' father. You can't get 400 years out of that, no matter how you stretch it. And the other disadvantage we have is, in this passage, we don't know how old they are when their firstborn is born. And that we have the nice advantage of having that information in the book of Genesis and several other places. So, in doing that, let's just look at, let's say, what if it is that 430-year period? We have the Pharaoh Sennacherib II. And it's interesting that the data of this period really fits in nicely to Joseph. And let me show you some of the things here. So it's a period of peace and prosperity. There are no military campaigns, and there is an elevated trade between Egypt and other nations. And that would make sense if he is the Pharaoh of the 7 years of plenty and then 7 years of famine. Also, there is a known famine in that time period. So, during Sennacherib II, the Pharaoh, there are these shepherd kings. Now, if you go on the internet, a lot of people say the Hyksos means foreign kings. But I'm going to stick with shepherd kings, and I'll show you why a little bit later. Josephus called them shepherd kings, but that's not why I'm sticking to it. There's another reason. So at the tomb of Sennacherib, one of his advisors, his viziers, there is a biography of his life. And in that biography, the painting on the tomb walls, we have the Hyksos shepherd kings. And as we look here, they do not look like Egyptians. In fact, they do look like what we read in the Bible, possibly of Canaanite or Israel. Now, remember, the Hebrews were in the land of Canaan. And so they may have the appearance of Canaanites of that time period. Archaeologists look at this and say, well, these are Canaanites. Well, they dwelt among the Canaanites. And I'm sure that they pick up some different things there. This is an artist's illustration to try to sharpen that image there. But what we want to look at is this little area right up here. So he is called Abisha, the Hyksos. Now, Abisha means God is my father in Hebrew, and it is a similar spelling of the word Abishai, who was one of David's nephews, who was in his army as one of his advisors. The shepherd staff that you see here is going to become, and it's not at this time, but the Egyptian hieroglyph for scepter is a double-horned ram with a two-pronged thing at the bottom, and sometimes you see that scepter used in the ancient hieroglyphs among the gods even. Now, when you get past the time of the Exodus on the timeline, you see Tutankhamun, you see the pharaohs after that time period, Ramses, and they're on out, using what they call the hook and flail. And that hook is this heka. And see the heka right there? That's called a heka. That becomes the Egyptian hieroglyph for scepter. And in all of the Hyksos, in all of the ones that they've discovered that has their names, this is part of that scepter. Now here's the old scepter, and that's what it was called, was, because it was the old scepter. Just check and see if you're listening. And then this is what becomes the new Egyptian scepter. And if you've looked at Tutankhamen's tomb, you may recognize that. And I'm sorry I got my back to me, but I'm kind of, okay, so. Now, why is it marked? It is marked because the pharaohs would use the scepter they checked the royal coffers, which were the containers in which they put the grain in. And they would use the heka, their scepter, and it has measuring marks on it. And they would put it down and make sure that there's no stones, no rocks in the grain containers. And then the servants would put the lid on, and then the Pharaoh would mark it shut with his scepter ring. Remember, Joseph was given the scepter ring? Now, wouldn't it make sense if Joseph was in charge of the grain, he would have a scepter ring? Maybe Joseph came up with something like this. Now, that's a lot of supposition, but let's just follow along here. So, heka becomes the Egyptians' word for measuring the grain, but it also is scepter, ruler. Now, why would they use a shepherd's staff, the Egyptians? The Bible tells us that anything to do with the shepherd was an abomination. Joseph's servants wouldn't even eat with him. And it was an abomination according to the Bible. Someday they're going to unearth something there in Egypt, I think, unless they already have and have announced it. But it's odd that they would have this become their scepter, unless a lot changed culturally in the Egyptian minds. This is Sennacherib the second there. And Goshen, we see, is in Lower Egypt. This land here is very marshy. This is a delta area. Anything that's built here is very difficult for archaeologists to go in and excavate because it has been muddy, it has been marshy. Things don't stand the test of time like they do in the other drier areas of Egypt. And so this is a more marshy area. This is where Joseph tells Jacob to ask to settle. So Sennacherib, who we were just talking about, the Pharaoh of this time period, moves his capital up to this area. And see this little area here? This is called the Fayum Peninsula. And they know that but Pharaohs after him continue to do this, develops this area because they're seeing a need for more grain. And the way to do this is they need to build a canal. And they do that. And a canal is built. So we need to take a look here. So a new capital is built towards the end of his reign. And I'm not even going to pronounce that. But it is moved up to here. Now remember, Goshen's up here. If you notice in the accounts when Joseph brings the family to Goshen, and especially like when Jacob is nearing death, they have to send for Joseph. Joseph is in another part of Egypt. He's not in Goshen. You can see as you read the text there that Joseph, it takes him some time to travel there if you read the text closely. Now, he ends up building the capital on this side, on the opposite side. So you're going to see the sunrise rather than the sunset. So that, in some Egyptian religion, that does make a difference. The Hyksos, they know over time, populate. And they end up building cities there, and their main city is called Avaris. And it becomes a fortified city at some point in time down the road here. So you've got the land of Goshen. You have in Egyptian history the Hyksos up there. This is Fayum and this area, and we're going to come in. And so I've already mentioned a 230-mile canal is built from the Nile River, and the engineering of this canal is quite interesting. It's really fantastic. fantastic that they were able to do this. They built a canal and to feed and grow grain there. The canal, if you go look at it today, and as long as Egyptians can go back and look in their records, this has been called in the well, in the Hebrew, but in the Egyptian too. It's been called Bar Yusuf. Now, what does that mean? It means Canal of Joseph. And it's been called that. No one knows that it's ever been called anything else. Some have said, well, it's been called the Great Canal of Egypt, and I'm sure that it could have been called that, but no one questions. The people that live there do not question. It is the Canal of Joseph. So as we go through this, and we look here, this is the canal, and it follows a particular lay of the land along the Nile River. Yeah, it's 230 miles, but guess what? It wasn't that they had to do a lot of excavating. It was able to be built, evidently, rather quickly because the way they follow the lay of the land with it. And so they connect the Nile River, and this is the way it looks today. And from a map here, so there's a natural lake that's up here, and because of the canal, they were able to make this lake, this oasis. And so this becomes a very fertile, important grain culture center. So it kind of makes sense, you know, so you kind of would like this to be up a little bit in your dating, you know, so it matches up closer to what you really think that the Joseph time period is going to be. But that's interesting there to know. One Egyptian or Egyptologist, and I've got his name and a link to his statement on my chart back there. He says the Egyptian chronology is in a critical state of disarray, and he admits that. There aren't many that will admit that. When Tim Mahoney does his documentary, and he's asking the liberal archaeologists, they would sit there and they would say, Israelites were never here. They could not have been here. The dates are off. And they don't even look at any evidence. And he would ask them a question about the history. No, not even possible. And so there the story goes. So here you can see the actual distance, how far that this canal goes. And so that's this, and then this is another figure with that information. So as we move along here, so that lines up with this time period. And so if you had the 430 years there, it would really match up with what dates they're using now. And you kind of really like that to work, but we have a real problem when we look at Exodus 6, and we can't stretch out those Kohath and Amram out that far. So these dates really need to move over based on Exodus chapter 6. The other thing that is found in the 13th dynasty is what is called the Brooklyn Papyrus, and it is at the Brooklyn Museum in New York. The Brooklyn Papyrus is a woman who was married to a wealthy Egyptian, and she has a large household. They have 70 slaves. Half of those slaves have Hebrew names. And you can go online and find this document. You can go in and look at it. And one of the names, and I'm not saying that, get me straight here, I'm not saying this is Moses' mother, but the Hebrew name Jochebed is on that list. And it just shows you that, yes, indeed, that's a Hebrew name. And you can go through there and look at the Hebrew names that are on this list that were household servants. and that's the Brooklyn Papyrus. And it dates between these dates here, and so that falls in that time period. And so she's Theban, so it was in Thebes, which is further to the south. And so 45 Hebrew names, sorry, I got my numbers wrong. In the chronology, you see that there's a 14th dynasty, and that's kind of sketchy area when you get into the actual accepted dates. There are some of these Hyksos, but the real time the Hyksos become real populated is during this time, which is called the 15th dynasty, and that is really called the Hyksos period. You see that there is the Abydos dynasty, and these, they believe, are just nothing more than priests and really no pharaohs. And then there is a 16th dynasty, and then there's a 17th dynasty. The 17th dynasty is going to have a lot of problems with the Hyksos. They don't like them, and there's going to be a lot of, we see that there's a lot of aggression between the two sides in this period. So the 16th dynasty is really down in, you had a dynasty up here, but then they moved down to Thebes. And they know that the Hyksos began to go beyond the boundaries here, and they start moving and getting into some of these other areas. The Hyksos that they find, and I don't have a photo up here, unfortunately. I have someone making a replica of the one head that they found. And they have, they're not Egyptian. And their hair, the paint anyway that's still on there, it seems that they had a little more red hair than what the Egyptians were dark-headed. And so you can tell it's a different race of people. And so that was what was discovered. We see that there is a pharaoh and Sequimni Kiel. And I didn't say that right, but it's difficult for me to pronounce. So he has a battle in 1550 BC, and he is killed. Well, that's going to create a new dynasty, although it is his son that will have another battle with the Hyksos. And it is Ahmose the first. And so you have a new dynasty that comes up. Ahmose the first defeats the Hyksos and subdues them in that time period. Now, if the Hyksos are the Hebrews, there's a lot of things here that's happening that kind of is interesting. If you look here, now this is what they call him today, usually on the internet, but they tell you that he is also known as Moses. Does that sound like anything? Moses. And this part, this means born. Moses means born in Egyptian. And means of water. So this is, and I'm not saying that that's Moses, but I'm just showing you that this name in Egyptian is starting to be used in this 18th dynasty. And I'm saying that the Exodus is in this time period. So let's take a look here. 1534, Aaron's 4 years older than Moses, correct? And Moses is born then if you do the math backwards, he's going to be born in 1530. So 1590 or 1490, Moses flees to Midian, and then 1450 is going to be the Exodus. So you've got Moses there. Now look, the 17th dynasty king is killed. Then Ahmosis in 1535 subdues the Hyksos, and it kind of lines up with the time period that Moses would be born. And then you have several. You have Ahmosis the first, the second, and if Pharaoh's daughter is daughter to a Pharaoh named Ahmosis, wouldn't it kind of fall into line? Now, I know the Bible tells us that means to draw out, but that's also a sort of a term for birthing, to draw forth. So he's born, he goes to Midian, and then the Exodus, and then the wilderness. Right in here, in this period. Now, this name, Ipwer, is a common name used up to 1450 BC. Ipwer, okay? Ipwer writes a papyrus, and it is at the Royal Dutch Museum. So, let's take a look at that. That's what the Ipwer papyrus is also known as the Papyrus Leiden 344. And the name Ipwer ceases to be used after 1450 BC. Now, I was telling somebody back there today, the Ipwer papyrus is almost a parallel of the plagues of Egypt. The curator of the Royal Dutch Museum admits that it is nearly a perfect parallel of the plagues of Egypt. But then he would say the dates are wrong. And that's usually the argument that they give you. The Ipwer papyrus. Let's take a look at this, and that might be all that we have time to do tonight. And I hope I'm not boring you with this, but look at this. The plague throughout the land is everywhere. Blood is everywhere. The river is blood. Now, if you go look this up on Wikipedia, they will give you this part. They will talk about the river being blood, and then they will explain that away, saying, well, it's red clay, it must look like blood. Then why would he be complaining? Why would he be complaining? He says the river is blood. Humans shrink from tasting and thirst after water. That is our water, that is our happiness. What shall we do? In retrospect, all is ruined. Let me tell you, if it's only clay that's in the water, you can take that water, scoop it out, and you can easily remove that sediment. I mean, it doesn't take a real scientist to figure out how to let the sediment go down. You wouldn't be athirst. You wouldn't be complaining like this. Now, what Ipwer is writing is treasonous to write during the time in the ancient world. You never would write anything that talks about the Pharaoh is losing control or Caesar is losing control. You don't write critical material. Just think of the communists and how they control things. And that's the way it was. The kings ruled, and they did not want anybody talking bad. Now, the Genesis account here is over here. Forsooth, the gates and columns and walls are consumed by fire. You see this over here in Genesis chapter 9? Lower Egypt weeps, the entire palace is without its revenues. Remember the crops that are destroyed there in Genesis? The grain has perished, and you look over here in chapter 9, and you see that parallel there. And then look at the animals, their hearts weep, the cattle are left astray. Look at this, chapter 9, verse 3. The cattle in the field. The land is without light. There's thick darkness all in the land of Egypt. I mean, is that a parallel or is that a parallel? The children of the princes are dashed against the walls. The children of the princes are dashed out into the streets. The prison is ruined. He who places his brother in the ground is everywhere. And this sounds like it could be a parallel to the death of the firstborn. Does it not? Now, this one, fire has mounted up on high. It goes burning forth against the enemies of the land. The cloud, by day a pillar of cloud to lead them by the way, and by night a pillar of fire to give them light to go by day and night. When the Israelites came up to the Red Sea and they were going to cross it, and they saw Pharaoh's armies coming, what did God do? He set that pillar of fire between the Israelites and the armies of Pharaoh. To me, this sounds like a first-hand account of somebody that may have seen that. Now, how many people have ever heard of this Ipwar Papyrus? I've never heard of it until I watched Tim Mahoney's documentary. And then I went into it further. Tim Mahoney doesn't go into it in this amount of detail. And then he talks about gold and lapis and silver and all these precious stones are fastened on the neck of female slaves. Now look at chapter 12, 35 through 36. The children of Israel did according, and what do? Jewels of silver, gold, and raiment. And then after 1450, that name's not used anymore in Egyptian history. How many people in America do you know named Benedict? I know some people that are named that in the UK, but I don't know anybody that loves their child in America that names their child Benedict. And why is that? Because he was a traitor, right? And it only makes sense, and it has some interesting parallels here. So what I want to do here tonight is I will pause here, and tomorrow night we're going to look at the conquest in the period of Amarna in the Egyptian history. There was found at Amarna letters that went unanswered by King Akhenaten. I have gone through and read all of the Amarna letters, and there is a term that is used for the Hebrews, and it is called Hapru or Akru without the H. It is sort of a derogatory term, meaning someone that has no home. Well, isn't that kind of what the Hebrews were when they left the land of Egypt? It's used by the Egyptians. It's used by the ones that were cuneiform outside of Egypt. They write letters to Akhenaten saying, the Akrus have invaded our land. We need help. We're being overrun. Letter after letter after letter after letter. You know, they're not teaching us this history. And it's plain as day. The king of Jerusalem's name is in the letters, asking for archers to come and help. So we'll look at that tomorrow night, and I will end.